Welcome to Theology in Action, in this series entitled, Why Study Church History? Significant Moments. In this series, we're going to look at great moments and great figures and discover why their lives matter and how they impact us today.
Hello, and welcome to Theology in Action. Today, as we continue learning about why Christians should study church history, we're going to take a look at the life and teachings of Augustine. When I was younger, I thought that as long as I knew God and I read the Bible, I had all the information I needed to live a good, godly life. And that is a true statement. But as I grew in my faith, I began to face challenges in applying that faith to real-world situations. Naturally, I turned to the wisdom of others who had already faced those challenges and found their answers in the Bible. In studying church history, I found a valuable resource, not for adding to the Bible, but for understanding how to apply biblical principles to my own life. One church father who was instrumental in clarifying and defending sound doctrine was Augustine of Hippo. Today, let's take a look at how Augustine used scripture to address some critical issues of his day. Augustine was born in 354 AD in Tagaste, North Africa, and he lived until 430 AD when he died in Hippo, also in North Africa. He was raised by a devout Christian mother, but despite her prayers, he did not turn to the Lord in his childhood. In his book, Confessions, Augustine recalls instances of sin as a youth, when his main focus was his own desires rather than God's. Augustine received an education in Tagaste and Carthage, and then pursued a career in rhetoric. He proved to be quite skilled in this area. He traveled from Tagaste to Carthage to attend school. He began teaching in Carthage, and then traveled to Rome and Milan to advance his career as a professor. It was in Milan that Augustine finally met the Lord. He began attending the church where Ambrose was bishop, and he was deeply impacted by Ambrose's preaching. Augustine became a catechumen in the church. This move was mainly to help his career at first, but God used it for much more. As the story goes, one day Augustine heard a child repeating the words, "Take up and read." Randy Peterson summarized the experience and impact by saying, "Something went click in his mind, the lights went on, and when he really got serious about Christianity, it uprooted his life." Now that Augustine had a saving knowledge of Jesus, it didn't just affect his Sunday mornings. His future, his career, his friends, his family, his hobbies, everything in his life was impacted by that single decision. Augustine was baptized in 387 AD by Ambrose, along with his son and his dear friend Alypius. He returned to Tagaste with the intention of serving the church there, but God had other plans. Augustine traveled to Hippo, where he was made a priest and then bishop of the church. He spent much of his time teaching the church about doctrine and preaching against heresy. Augustine taught his church the doctrines of original sin and salvation by grace. These doctrines outline what the Bible teaches about man's moral depravity and need for God's grace to restore us. The doctrine of original sin teaches that man is born sinful as a result of Adam's disobedience in the Garden of Eden, and man needs God's grace before he can obey God or be considered righteous before him. As it says in Romans 5:12, sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. R.C. Sproul writes, "Original sin does not refer to the first sin of Adam and Eve, but refers to the consequences for the human race of that first sin. It refers to God's judgment upon the whole human race by which he visits upon us the effects of Adam's sin by the thoroughgoing corruption of all his descendants." The need for salvation by grace hinges on the truth of original sin. As it says in Ephesians 2:8-9, "By grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." This grace also enables us to turn away from sin and obey God, and without grace, we wouldn't be able to do that either. Augustine's teaching on these subjects brought about a disagreement from the British monk Pelagius. To summarize R.C. Sproul's writing on the matter, Pelagius taught that Adam's sin did not lead to the corruption of the human race, and individuals can only share in Adam's guilt if they sin themselves. People were born righteous, and as long as they worked hard and they stayed that way, they didn't need God's grace to be saved, because they hadn't lost their right standing before God. The Pelagian controversy drove Augustine to clarify and strengthen his support of the doctrines of original sin and salvation by grace. Pelagius' teachings were condemned in multiple church councils, the Council of Carthage in 418 and the Council of Ephesus in 431. According to R.C. Sproul, Pelagianism is still condemned by both Protestants and Roman Catholics. As I studied this controversy, I began to wonder how it might be addressed today. In our modern age, there are so many different beliefs, so many different denominations, that it might be easy to dismiss Pelagianism as just a facet of a different Christian denomination. Or one could say that Pelagius was entitled to his opinions, or that we can't force anyone to reject Pelagianism in favor of correct doctrine. Maybe some would say that as long as you believe in sound doctrine, this controversy isn't even worth talking about. But those statements fail to address the deeper issues that come from allowing heresy to go unchallenged. Pelagius' teachings, if believed, would cause people to say that they didn't necessarily need God's grace if they did the right works. Taken a bit further, one could say that if Pelagius was correct, then the Apostle Paul was wrong when he wrote in Romans about original sin, or in Ephesians about salvation by grace. One interesting thing about heresies is that if they are accepted and taken to their logical conclusions, they attack more than just one or two doctrines of the church. They spread and begin impacting more foundational beliefs, causing those who believe them to be more and more lost. In his autobiography, Confessions, Augustine wrote, "The rejection of heretics brings into relief what the church holds and what sound doctrine maintains." Though the Pelagian controversy happened years after Confessions was written, the truth of this statement is clear. By addressing the Pelagian controversy with biblical truth, Augustine strengthened his biblical arguments for original sin and salvation by grace. He was able to teach the church how the doctrines he taught came from Scripture, and therefore why the truth of the doctrine mattered. The record of this controversy, as well as the others that Augustine was involved in, also serve as a guide for Christians today. When Augustine's teaching of sound doctrine led to an argument, he stood firm, defended the truth of the Bible, and challenged incorrect teachings. I pray that we can also stand firm in defending the truth and follow the example of the historical church.